Chapter 14, Eldred 2. The day Eldred was decided, fate would have it that I was to travel to Washington, D.C. The day the rehearing petition in Eldred was denied, meaning the case was really finally over, fate would have it that I was giving a speech to technologists at Disney World. This was a particularly long flight to my least favorite city. The drive into the city from Dulles was delayed because of traffic, so I opened up my computer and wrote an op-ed piece. It was an act of contrition. During the whole of the flight from San Francisco to Washington, I had heard over and over again in my head the same advice from Don Ayer. You need to make them see why it is important. And alternating with that command was the question of Justice Kennedy. Quote, "For all these years, the act has impeded progress in science and the useful arts. I just don't see any empirical evidence for that." End quote. And so, having failed in the argument of constitutional principle, finally, I turned to an argument of politics. The New York Times published the piece. In it, I proposed a simple fix. 50 years after a work has been published, the copyright owner would be required to register the work and pay a small fee. If he paid the fee, he got the benefit of the full term of copyright. If he did not, the work passed into the public domain. We called this the Eldred Act, but that was just to give it a name. Eric Eldred was kind enough to let his name be used once again, but as he said early on, it won't get passed unless it has another name. Or another two names. For depending upon your perspective, this is either the Public Domain Enhancement Act or the Copyright Term Deregulation Act. Either way, the essence of the idea is clear and obvious. Remove copyright where it is doing nothing except blocking access and the spread of knowledge. Leave it for as long as Congress allows for those works where its worth is at least $1, but for everything else, let the content go. The reaction to this idea was amazingly strong. Steve Forbes endorsed it in an editorial. I received an avalanche of emails and letters expressing support. When you focus the issue on lost creativity, people can see the copyright system makes no sense. As a good Republican might say, here government regulation is simply getting in the way of innovation and creativity. And as a good Democrat might say, here the government is blocking access and the spread of knowledge for no good reason. Indeed, there's no real difference between Democrats and Republicans on this one. Anyone can recognize the stupid harm of the present system. Indeed, many recognize the obvious benefit of the registration requirement. For one of the hardest things about the current system for people who want to license content is that there's no obvious place to look for the current copyright owners. Since registration is not required, since marking content is not required, since no formality at all is required, it is often impossibly hard to locate copyright owners to ask permission to use or license their work. This system would lower these costs by establishing at least one registry where copyright owners could be identified. As I described in Chapter 10, formalities in copyright law were removed in 1976, when Congress followed the Europeans by abandoning any formal requirement before copyright is granted. The Europeans are said to view copyright as a, quote, natural right, end quote. Natural rights don't need forms to exist. Traditions, like the Anglo-American tradition that required copyright owners to follow form if their rights were to be protected, did not, the Europeans thought, properly respect the dignity of the author. My right as a creator turns on my creativity, not upon the special favor of the government. That's great rhetoric. It sounds wonderfully romantic, but it is absurd copyright policy. It's absurd especially for authors because a world without formality harms the creator. The ability to spread, quote, Walt Disney creativity, end quote, is destroyed when there's no simple way to know what's protected and what's not. The fight against formalities achieved its first real victory in Berlin in 1908. International copyright lawyers amended the Berne Convention in 1908 to require copyright terms of life plus 50 years, as well as the abolition of copyright formalities. The formalities were hated because the stories of inadvertent loss were increasingly common. It was as if a Charles Dickens character ran all copyright offices, and the failure to dot an I or cross a T resulted in the loss of widows' only income. These complaints were real and sensible, and the strictness of the formalities, especially in the United States, were absurd. The law should always have ways of forgiving innocent mistakes. There's no reason copyright law couldn't as well. Rather than abandoning formalities totally, the response in Berlin should have been to embrace a more equitable system of registration. Even that would have been resisted, however, because registration in the 19th and 20th centuries was still expensive. It was also a hassle. The abolishment of formalities promised not only to save the starving widows, but also to lighten an unnecessary regulatory burden imposed upon creators. In addition to the practical complaint of authors in 1908, there was a moral claim as well. There was no reason that creative property should be a second-class form of property. If a carpenter builds a table, his rights over the table don't depend upon filing a form with the government. He has a property right over the table, quote, naturally, end quote, and he can assert that right against anyone who would steal the table, whether or not he has informed the government of his ownership of the table. This argument is correct, but its implications are misleading. For the argument in favor of formalities does not depend upon creative property being second-class property. The argument in favor of formalities turns upon the special problems that creative property presents. The law of formalities responds to the special physics of creative property to assure that it can be efficiently and fairly spread. No one thinks, for example, that land is second-class property just because you have to register a deed with a court if your sale of land is to be effective. And few would think a car is second-class property just because you must register a car with the state and tag it with a license. In both of these cases, everyone sees that there is an important reason to secure registration, both because it makes the markets more efficient and because